Right, good. That's the South African team out in the ICJ. They're making some representation for the third time now. They're calling for the immediate halt to Israel's invasion, military action in Rafah, upholding international law and the ground troops into Rafah to be completely halted. Of course, the central question is whether or not the court will be able this time around to give them that explicit modification to the order. Ayesha, hopefully we can hear you clearly now on the line. It's the third time that South Africa is attempting to get this explicit order to call for military action to be seized in Gaza. Do you think it will be a success this time around?
I think it will be, actually, because it's become increasingly evident that the intent from Israel is genocidal. Even today's Times of Israel has an article running that says that the repercussions for Israel could be very, very severe, and quotes an Israeli academic, a Kapinski, as saying in March the ICJ didn't hold hearings when South Africa applied for new emergency measures, but did issue strict orders regarding humanitarian aid. Whereas, in the February emergency aid application that South Africa made, that was more or less ignored by the court, even though it did issue sharper orders against Israel to increase the supply of humanitarian aid to Gaza and open the crossings, etc. So what has happened is that I think this time around, the court has responded very, very quickly to South Africa's request for new emergency measures hearing, for a hearing on new emergency measures. The request only went in last week, and already this Tuesday, the court said it would hear South Africa and Israel if they wish to respond today and tomorrow. So there's been a very quick turnaround by the court this time, which indicates that the court is viewing this with increasing urgency. And I think that this time around, we are going to get that order that Israel at least halts all military operations in Rafah, although South Africa is calling for all military operations not only in Rafah, but in the rest of Gaza. And the case made today by the South African legal team was a very, very cogent one, with Advocate Adila Hashim, for example, pointing out 5 instances in which Israel is repeatedly and consistently violating the Genocide Convention, and particularly the provision for not inflicting conditions of life calculated to annihilate in part or in whole an entire group of people. So that is a very, very salient and cogent point. It was made not only by Advocate Hashim, but also by South African ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Madonsela, as well as Professor John Dugard, Professor Vaughan Lowe, the Irish lady whose name I can never pronounce properly, so I'm not even going to try, but she was brilliant as well. And of course, our very own Advocate Tembega as well. So, we have a power-packed legal team, and they made very, very salient and cogent arguments, supported and underpinned, as the previous applications have been, by facts on the ground, by statistics from humanitarian organizations, from UN organizations. At the very least, I think the court will be forced to order Israel to allow, unlimited aid in, and to allow humanitarian workers, particularly UN workers, but also those of other humanitarian agencies into the territory, and to halt its operation in Rafah. There is also, of course, the concomitant, at least on paper and at least in public, disapproval of the U.S. with regard to Israeli operations in Rafah. And I think that will also tie into the court's decision.
So it seems from the remarks from Israel, once again, Israel is going to continue to rely on the fact that this case has not yet reached a point where genocidal intent is being tried. So the case continues, and it's going to take a while still before we get to that point. So they'll continue to want to continue with their operations there, but also their response continuing to mischaracterize, I suppose, what the courts are saying, because the courts are stopping short of saying you need to cease military action in
yes.
Gaza.
Yes, and that is why I say I think what we're going to see is an order to cease military action in Rafah, but perhaps not in all of Gaza. Also, what needs to be taken into account is, once again, even more incendiary comments about operations in Gaza by senior Israeli officials. And I'll just give you one, Thabo. At the end of April, Finance Minister Smotrich was quoted by Haaretz, an Israeli publication, as saying there are no half measures. Rafah, Deir al-Balah, Nuseirat, total annihilation. Now, if that's not genocidal, I don't know what is.
Humanitarian aid is also proving to be a real issue here, as well as fact-finding missions that are allowed to actually get the information on the ground. What measures do you think the courts can give more? I mean, except for the fact that there needs to be adequate reporting and there needs to be aid that is allowed, and the fact that the missions, fact-finding missions, should be allowed. What more can the court say to put that point across in a stronger way?
I think the court can say that, that the refusal to allow sufficient aid in. Now, what's quite interesting, Thabo, is that since the application went in by South Africa, suddenly we've seen Israeli and some international media flooded by images of aid being allowed in through both the Rafah crossing and the one at in northern Gaza, the one that was recently opened, particularly because northern Gazans particularly are starving. But we've also seen on the other side of the coin. So we've seen on May 9th, 10th, and 12th, we've seen images coming out of the Israeli state, essentially saying, here, we're allowing aid in. But what UN officials and humanitarian agencies are saying is that that is extremely limited, and after many weeks, and not even a drop in the ocean of what is needed. And then, as I said, on the other side of that coin, what we are seeing is some very horrific images of young children, and these images have gone viral, young Jewish Israeli children destroying aid destined for Gaza and putting that aid into, basically tearing up the aid packages and putting the remains into garbage cans, into the trash, as it were. And, that has, I think, really swayed, in certain instances, public opinion. And it's really quite horrific to see that children, as young as sort of primary school age children are doing this kind of thing. And it points to the inculcation of hatred and the dehumanization of Palestinians, even among Israeli children. And I think that those images were particularly powerful, and hopefully at least some, if not all, of the judges at the ICJ have seen some of these images, have seen also, of course, the images and the statistics that were presented today, right, of the people starving, and of the fact that Rafah, as Khan Yunis before it, Deir al-Balah, Nuseirat before it, all of them before it were designated safe zones by the IDF itself. And then the IDF essentially bombarded those zones and has now begun to do the very same thing in Rafah. So what is said on the one hand, and people are, encouraged to move there, in fact, forcibly moved there in many instances, and told that you'll be safe here, and then they're not safe there. They have to move again. It's now reached a point where there is nowhere to go, and they are being bombarded.
International Relations expert Ayesha Kajee, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Right, let's take a break. When we continue next, the royal row in the Zulu monarch in court once again. Now we'll get some analysis of the latest issues being contended there in our court of law. Stay with us.